that have actually joined us today, if you could just type in the chat box to tell me whether or not you can hear me. I just want to make sure that it's all clear. Fabulous. If at any time there are any problems, just do use the chat box to let me know. So firstly, thank you for taking the time to listen to myself and Sally from Sylo Associates talk to you about, is your recruitment campaign GDPR compliant? At the end of the webinar, I will ask you a very simple question as to whether or not you are happy for either Sally or myself to follow up with you. Obviously, you absolutely have the right to say no, and you can just use the webinar as a resource. It is being recorded, so you will have access to the webinar via our website and Sylo's website within the next week. And if you have any questions, if I could just ask that you hold on to them until the question section, and both Sally and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. So we have half an hour of delivering the of the webinar, and then we've got 15 minutes for questions should we need that. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction. So, Sally, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Kelly. So I am one of the founders and directors of Sylo Associates, HR consultancy of 10 years now. I'm based here in Tame. There you go.
And Sally has, this is the third webinar that I have done with Sylo. So I'm Kelly, I'm the co-founder of Data Basics. We did a webinar back in January on data breaches and subject access requests and the practical ways of handling them, as well as HR for professionals. So should you wish to see those again, you can just go to our website and watch those for free. So, okay, let's go on to the main meat of what we're going to be talking about today. And that really is, you know, is the recruitment campaign that you are running compliant with the regulation? And Sally's going to interject in terms of the experience that she's had about questions that we all should be considering. Now, we're not going to be able to cover everything today, but we've covered what we believe are the key elements. So everyone that's on this webinar, I'm confident that you're all very passionate about finding the right people for your organisation and having a fantastic culture, which is underpinned by a strong data protection ethos. So we know that you love people and that you want to make sure that you are maintaining their welfare, and that GDPR isn't going to be a deterrent for that or used in any kind of harmful or malicious way. So you're all here because you want to do the right thing. So one of the things that was very apparent before the regulation came into force last year was a lot of contracts and privacy notices, if they existed, were very much based on one lawful basis. It was very much consent, consent, consent. And actually, when the law changed, the onus was on all organisations to reflect to say, actually, consent is not the right basis for processing every piece of recruitment information. There may absolutely be a reason for consent. So unsuccessful candidates, can they give you consent for you to retain their CVs because they look like a good candidate and you want to retain their details, and you've got that permission. But it's not the only driver. So your CV that you're receiving from all of your prospective candidates has a wealth of information in that. It doesn't just have a name and a contact details. It has their employment history. It will have their skills, their whether or not they're degree, educated, etc., etc. So we have to make sure the basis that we're processing on it is correct. So one of the things I'd ask you to think about is, do you know and are you confident that the lawful basis that you're using is correct for all the different types of data that you're collecting on candidates as part of the recruitment journey, from initial expression to the point when they actually join you as a member of staff, whether it be full-time or part-time? that then leads on quite nicely to the question of, do your candidates know exactly what you are using their data for? And I think it's quite easy to assume that because they're going through the recruitment process that they know why you're processing the data, but that's not necessarily true, and it's not an assumption that we can make. In fact, we have an obligation under the regulation to inform individuals how we're processing their information. So it's important to let people, the candidates, know how you use their information. So what are you going to do with it? Who are you going to share it with? So do you have other organisations that are part of the recruitment process that you'd share data with? Are you uploading their information to a cloud-based solution? You're sharing that information outside of your organisation. How secure is that? You want to be able to reassure your candidates that their data is precious and that you are confident about how it's being secure.
I was just thinking then, actually, Kelly, part of this isn't about thinking of it just as a legal process, is it?
No.
It's actually about having good communication to candidates, which will only emphasise the professionalism of the company they're looking to join. And I think of it's looking at it in that way. So that peace of mind, that assurance that you were just talking about.
Yeah, and I think when they become an employee, it's then no surprise, just how important you as an organisation take data protection. So really do ask yourself, do you have such things as privacy notices? Now, what we find is that there will be an employee privacy notice, but there seems to be a missing gap in having a candidate privacy notice. So it's certainly something worth considering, or at least direct them to the section of your privacy notice that is relevant to them as a candidate. What I think is fundamental about the regulation, and it's all driven on making sure that we protect the rights and freedoms of individuals and whoever those individuals are. And in this instance, we're very much talking about candidates. So remember that during their recruitment journey, a candidate will have different rights that they can ask you to address. So they have the right to access their information. So if they were unsuccessful, a candidate can say to you, I want to see my interview notes. Obviously, it goes without saying that you need to be very cautious about what you put on your interview notes. I've seen some very interesting comments written on side notes of the interview notes, and actually they're all have to be shared with the candidate. They might have, if you're using legitimate interest as a reason for processing data, they have the right to object to that. They may say they gave you consent to hold the CV for up to 12 months. And now what they're doing is they're contacting you and saying, hi, company ABC, I'd now like you to delete my CV. I wasn't successful. I've found another job. I no longer want you to hold my details. Please delete. Now, you need to be prepared for that and be able to be confident that your systems can absolutely support that process. Mm-hmm. Only this week did a German development company get fined £12.5 million because they couldn't delete information from an archive system. So if you were to archive old CVs, you need to be confident that you can delete them. And again, if you're building a talent pool, which I know is something that Sally has talked about, it's make sure they have the right to correct their information. They may want to give you updated telephone number or an updated email address. So make sure you've got the processes to support that. So how well do you know the whereabouts of the data? Now, 20 years ago, I'm sure that was a pretty easy question. It would have been in a filing cabinet, probably in your office, possibly on a computer, and may have been in an email system. If you think about today, a CV, when it comes into you, could be circulated to the recruitment managers within your organisation. Now, that may be more than one. I'm an ex-NHS member of staff, and I used to be on a panel of 4 people. So that CV would have gone to 4 different people's email accounts. It could have been stored in each of those individuals' personal drives on their computer. It may also be stored on a HR Excel spreadsheet for all the potential candidates they're looking to shortlist. It may also be stored in a cloud-based solution. So as I'm just thinking about it, I'm thinking about rather than it being 1 or 2 places, one candidate's piece of information could be in 10 to 15 different places. So if you get a request to delete, you need to know where that data is so that you can fulfill that request confidently. And obviously, dare I mention the dreaded breach word, but if candidates' data has been affected, you want to know where all that information is and just how much information could have been affected. So we're going to kind of tag team this slide. I'm going to do a little bit, then I'm going to hand over to Sally to do quite a bit more of the talking. But I really wanted to ask you the question about how legitimate is your data gathering. On one too many occasions, I've heard people that are headhunting individuals. They will go through LinkedIn, they will scrape information off LinkedIn, and they will automatically pull it into their own systems. Now, if you go back to the right to be informed, that individual doesn't know that you're doing that. They don't know that you're interested in them as an individual. Now, you can absolutely circumvent that by having a conversation with them in the very first instance via LinkedIn to say, we are looking at, a candidate that has your skill set. Would you be interested in us having a more detailed conversation with you? Can we hold some of your information on our systems? You're then asking them, and they may be like, yes, actually, it's the right time for me. I'm looking for a new challenge.
Yeah, so I think that's that whole point about engaging with candidates and at the same time professionalising the communication in terms of what information you need, how you will store it, and as part of your recruitment campaign, you'll be keeping in contact with them. So in terms of GDPR, we would always be saying to you that you have to go back to those points of contact from research we may have done on LinkedIn, through CVs given at a job fair, just to confirm with them the basis on which you hold the information. And you will do that with candidates that are applying for a job, but you may not do that follow-up with candidates which you've contacted through these other sources. Which then takes us on to our next slide. So we know, for example, that you can obviously go to those sources to obtain candidate information, LinkedIn, CV fairs and what have you, recruitment fairs. But however, you might also find value in using a third-party recruiter, especially for specialist roles that might be difficult to fill. But have you truly tested out their compliance on data protection? And it's we've seen some quite difficult and challenging problems for some of our clients where this hasn't been satisfied. So they're holding data on candidates, but actually have they obtained their permission to do so? Have they obtained their permission to then pass that information on? And the reason why I say this is we've had clients that have had candidates presented to them by a third-party recruiter that they used 2 years before. The candidate had not confirmed that they wished for their details to be passed forward. The client's left with a legitimate contract in place with that recruiter, that recruitment agency, and is presented with the challenge of having to pay a fee because the CV was presented to them. And equally, they've hired this person who's put in this difficult position on starting. So that could have all been avoided if they'd reviewed the terms of business with the recruitment agencies that they use, as with all third-party suppliers that they've asked for them to demonstrate their compliance in handling data. So it's just showing there, what the benefits to you are in doing that, because you wouldn't want to find yourself having to pay a fee or for one of your new employees to be in that position.
Yeah. And I think it's showing your accountability and your due diligence that you have, where all the people you can confidently say that you engage with are compliant with the regulation, and you can say no to the ones that can't demonstrate that requirement.
Okay. So the next aspect is looking at all the information you hold, and Kellie talked about this earlier in terms of those handwritten notes that will have been scribbled down and jotted down during an interview, but we really wanted to highlight that this is at every stage. So pre-screening, telephone interviews, as well as the face-to-face interviews that you'll carry out, they're all points of contact with candidates, and you'll be making notes and holding information against their name, it's personal data. And if you were ever asked to respond to a subject access request, then you'd be required to do so. So again, it goes back to the point of, do you train your managers? Do you abide by your retention of data policy? So that you do destroy recruitment records after the retention period. It's really very key. And I think also when you're communicating if you're taking up references, that you communicate to referees, how that information will be stored and the rights of access to that information. That, to be honest, that right to see a reference has always been there pre-GDPR, but because of SARS, we know that your chances of being asked to see that information are greater. So again, think of this from your end-to-end process and what information you're going to be holding.
And I would just add, on the selection process, I've seen a lot of things recently about how you can use information that is in social media. That's aside from LinkedIn. There was a recent article in a paper where a young lady was rejected for a job because of some of the photos that she'd pasted on Facebook. Now, put aside the part that she might need to look at her privacy settings, the company hadn't disclosed to this individual that they were looking at social media as a way of their screening process and was part of their selection process. This hit the national press, and that company, I'd say their reputation has been quite tarnished by this. So I would say where you are looking to source information from the likes of social media, you need to be prepared to be able to reveal that as part of a subject access request. But more importantly, you absolutely need to tell the individual that this forms part of your selection criteria.
And I mean, I would like to think, when you're designing your recruitment campaign, if you're setting out the stages of your process, that you can communicate that very easily. And if you've got a privacy policy, you can signpost it so it doesn't become onerous. Another sort of follow-on in terms of the selection process, when the legislation first came out, it specifically talked about automated individual decision-making systems. So we've seen less of this in the press, but it is just worth reminding you that if you use applicant tracking systems with preset questions which will determine if a candidate goes forward, that candidate has the right to say they won't apply using that system, when you would have to find some other means to capture that information. You won't be challenged if your questions are legitimate and right questions to be asking a candidate, such as right to work in the UK. But for those companies that have applicant tracking systems, we're just worth highlighting that. And psychometrics specifically, we handle psychometric testing for our clients, and so we know the sorts of data that those reports can hold. So clearly it will come under the GDPR regulations, how you hold it, how you communicate that information, and that candidates give their consent and so on. So you will make sure you provide those links to privacy notices with any communication, but make sure they know that you'll be using third parties to process that information, because psychometric testing companies are the ultimate vehicle for producing these tools. So again, you would check that they're GDPR compliant, and the way in which you communicate information is bound by what you said you're going to do. So just to the point about recruiting managers, if they are sent a report which talks about the personality preferences and personality types of candidates, which is useful for your selection process, that's stored and held centrally, it's archived, it's not forwarded on anywhere else, you nail down how you deal with that type of information. And you could be handling internal applicants as well as external candidates. So it becomes sensitive from a sort of PR perspective, not just about GDPR sensitivity as well. So just think about those that particular aspect of selection. And how well do you protect your candidate data? So I talked there about where you store all your information, and having a system and a repository to hold all of this. Kellie, this recent particular news that you're highlighting here, could you sort of go into detail about it?
So earlier this month, there's been a number of issues with Amazon Web Services and what they refer to as their S3 bucket. Essentially, a lot of organisations were not ticking a box that said, don't expose this information to the outside world. Unfortunately, Sonic Jobs hadn't done that. So they exposed almost 30,000 CVs for UK retail and restaurants for the likes that Marriott and InterContinental chains would use. So there is an element of the due diligence, and I can't stress that enough, because they might not necessarily remember Sonic Jobs, but they may remember you, and they may think, oh, I wonder if you keep my data safe. So for me, what you want to make sure is that whatever systems you're using, whether they be internal to your organization or you're using external third-party sources, that they have done everything. And it's not just, yes, we have put in the appropriate technical measures. Ask them, what are those technical measures? You know, how confident are you that your data is not being exposed to the internet? How often do you back that information up? If your servers were to go down, how quickly could that information be restored? You know, these are all useful questions, and ones they should absolutely be able to answer. And for those that can't answer it, my challenge to you is, are you confident that they are adhering to the security principles of the regulation? And I'd say probably not.
And I also think, where are those server held?
Yeah.
I daren't say the Brexit word, but I just did then. But, you know, are they held within the EU? What would their plans be if we exit? You know, but equally, if it's outside of the EU and in America, what does that mean in terms of the data, in terms of where it's held? So it is worth asking those questions too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In terms of then this database, you want to have a repository, a place for storage to archive, and then to know that you've got measures in place that minimise that risk of breach. That's what Kellie was talking about there previously. But also, you keep putting that information in there. So it's just a temptation to just build and build and build a whole load of data, which actually you no longer need and would not be able to justify keeping under GDPR unless you've maintained some form of contact with candidates. So having a consent process after the recruitment campaign, making people aware of how long you'll keep that information, having systems in place then to keep in contact with those unsuccessful candidates means that you'll satisfy GDPR, but you'll build your talent pipeline. So, you know, to reduce your recruitment costs, it's going to benefit you there, but equally it'll also demonstrate that you do hold the right information, accurate information. People move, people's desires for jobs change, and you'll be satisfying the regulations. So it's worth just saying that. So in terms of the next slide, some of the online tools and sort of in practice tips that we would share using the system that we have is, you know, if you've got an online application, we know you advertise on a job board, for example, you can channel applicants through a process where you're capturing their data. They have completed it. They will tick a box giving consent, and actually it will then help you going forward retaining that record because it'll be date stamped. The system can archive it, and you can set tags to help with all that follow-up. So when I was talking about building the talent pipeline, those online tools can really help you. And also they start that journey. So for the successful candidates, great, you've done a hire. Our system can also help you with the onboarding because you started that data capture, and it will start with the induction process for you. So yeah, I mean, I'll hand over to you now, Kellie.
We're so excited to talk about this slide.
Yes.
So you've got to the point now that your new member of staff has arrived. It's their day one, and I think the real important point is that when they start on that day one, that you have everything they need to have access to. So they've got things such as, the policies that you're going to ask them to read, so they're aware of what they need access to. They've got the right system access in place. There's nothing worse than arriving on a job and you don't have a computer, you don't have an email account, you don't have the right access to the different systems that this individual will have. So, that onboarding startup form is useful for when they start, but also to involve other departments depending on the size of your business. But you want to make sure that the right access is given to the individual on day one, that if they're in a probation period, that you've got limits on to how long they're going to have access to, and you may not give them access or full access to everything until they've passed the probation, depending on what they're going to be accessing, for example. So, make sure that you've told them they need to bring evidence with them if that's what is required on day one. Don't take people by surprise, because neither party enjoys that experience. So please, it's best for everybody that your day one process is smooth, because you look professional, the individual feels really super welcome, and hopefully it's a long journey with you and the individual in your company. So in summary, and it's gone quite quickly, this half an hour, we've tried to cover quite a lot in the 30 minutes that we've had with you. And I appreciate it's quite a whistle-stop tour, but really make sure, so your need to knows are, make sure you have the correct basis for processing the candidate data, because if you don't, then you really shouldn't be processing it at all. So you won't have the candidate talent pool that Sally was talking about. You want to make sure that you only collect and store candidate data that's absolutely relevant to that recruitment process. So don't collect more than you need to have. And really, most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, is inform the individual. Make sure that you're in constant contact with them where appropriate about what information you're processing on them and why, so there can be no question about your transparency or your accountability when it comes to the regulation. And I think that only bodes well when they become a full-time or part-time member of your team. So we're going to quickly cover a few events, then we're going to answer any questions that are popping up. So start thinking about the questions that you have and type them into the box. So there are a few events that are going on. Sally, do you want to?
So we're running a free workshop on the 5th of December called Recruiting for Success. So I think it's a nice build from this webinar. It's all about, in Oxfordshire, with this war on talent, how you can actually position yourself in the best possible place of making the right hire, with some tips and hints from us, and also looking at salary benchmarking as part of that. So again, that's on Thursday the 5th of December here in Tame.
And then what Sally and I have been talking about is holding a workshop, and it'd be useful to know if you've got any ideas about what you'd like that to be. For us, it's about combining both the data protection elements of it as well as the employment elements. So what makes the most amount of sense? Is it recruitment? Is it whilst the individual is in the workplace, or is it on exit, which is the webinar, our 4th webinar that we're going to be looking to host in early next year? Is you put all this effort into onboarding. What happens when that individual leaves the organisation? What are the checks that you need to make sure that you have and you can evidence that you've done, so the individual doesn't walk away with information that belongs to you and that they can't share? So dates will follow soon for that. So we can help in a number of ways. So for us from Data Basics, if you need any advice and guidance on training for staff, if you don't know where your data is and need an understanding of gaps in terms of data protection, we can help you. And we can also do any of the mapping exercise and challenge you on any of the security data protection elements. And Sylo,
Well, we can deal with some of the nuts and bolts around recruitment. So if you don't have that in-house expertise and you want some additional help, then we can help with running recruitment campaigns, or specifically on psychometrics. So if you want to include that in your selection process, and any sort of policies that you might want in place to sort of communicate some of those responsibilities for staff.
And we've just had one question, which was, will the slides be available after the event? And I just want to re-emphasize that this is a recorded webinar. It will be available to you afterwards, and I will send out to everyone that's registered, I'll send you out the link of the recording afterwards. So we've got some questions coming through, which is super exciting. So I'm going to read them out so everyone else knows what the questions are. And I will then, depending on who's most appropriate, will answer them. So let me start from, so we've got a question that says, what would be the most important to remember in using personal phone to access work emails, contact candidates after hours? That's a really good question. So the personal phone number of the candidate and their name makes it personal data. So you want to make sure that the individual is aware that you have their mobile phone and that you may need to contact them outside of hours. You may, and I know some people do this, use WhatsApp as a way of being able to contact candidates. So for me, from a data protection perspective, just be clear about what your process is, why you're collecting that information, how you're going to use it, and how long you're going to store it. So you're going to use it to contact them after hours, and it will only be used for this purpose. And then that, to me, then draws a line under that.
I think that's right. And I mean, if you were had approached a candidate through LinkedIn, you would have had exactly that exchange of conversation in a LinkedIn in-mail, confirming, you know, their interest, when and how you can contact them, what number that you could do so, and then you know, that would be registered that way. So, you know, it's always about transparency.
Absolutely. And one of the questions we have is about the event that Sylo's doing on the 5th of December. So I'll make sure that I have the full details, and everyone that's registered will get details on what the event is, where it is, and what will actually be covered. So the question, okay, this is a good question. So the question is, what's the recommended duration for keeping unsuccessful candidate data information, any of the reserve list, or where may be suitable for future opportunities, presumably cannot keep for too long? That's a really good question. So from a law perspective, you have to keep, so you absolutely have to keep information of unsuccessful candidates for a minimum of 6 months. So don't immediately delete them, because if that individual challenges you within that 6-month period because they feel they've been unfairly treated, they have the right to do that within that period. So at a minimum, retain all information for 6 months, and that is a legal requirement to do that, just because of the challenging process. Now, if they're unsuccessful, you may say, I'd like to keep your CV for longer than 6 months, but no more than a year, for example. So you've given the caveat of a minimum and a maximum time frame, and then make sure your systems support that. Because what happens is that people say that statement, and then they forget that in their candidate pool or their system, they've got CVs that are older than a year. Those that you don't intend on keeping, I would delete after 6 months. Because if they're not suitable, they were not the ideal candidates, they're not likely to be the ideal candidates. Once you've met the minimum threshold, I would remove them.
I think that's right. So why the 6 months? That is the law, but actually you will know, a number of you as HR professionals, that's because of the challenge process, potentially an employment tribunal, and the decision-making process that's happened. I think the up to 12 months is absolutely right. And I go back to the online systems that we use that will automatically auto-archive at that point. And then it removes, you know, it removes the task from somebody to have to do and perhaps forgets to do. That's the practicality. And the engagement, though, that you can have, that you continue to have, is key. So, you know, it's all well and good saying we've got you on file. We've all received one of those very generic letters, perhaps at some point. But, you know, it's how you maintain contacts with those reserves. we're having this conversation because we know you might have had a strong field of candidates, and that's why it's worth doing it.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump ahead to one question because it's linked to the conversation that we've just had, is what are the reasons that someone may feel that they've been unfairly treated? Now, previous to setting up the business, I used to work in the NHS, and we knew that there were individuals out there that had no intention of joining you as an organisation. Their intention was just to see how much trouble that they could create for an organisation. So they will use any particular card that they feel that they weren't given appropriate directions to the office. It sounds silly, or they were not appropriate accessibility to the building, or they were given not enough notice to attend the interview. They weren't given a subsequent option to, they couldn't meet the date of interview. Or they could ball the more extreme reasons of maybe their nationality, maybe the fact that English isn't their first language, or it may just be that they felt that the interviewers were not respectful of them during the interview process. So the list can go on, and I will honestly say I've experienced all of those scenarios during a long experience in the NHS. So you may have experienced different ones, but you always, that's why it's, don't put anything on an interview notes that you're not prepared to stand by. You know, make sure that you're absolutely open and transparent about it, because you don't know at what point that may catch you out.
So Kelly touched on all of the equality areas that you might be challenged, you know, in terms of your decision making, and that's what it will come down to. Were you treating candidates fairly, and therefore can you say that you treated all candidates consistently and appropriately? So, you know, rather than sort of thinking from a defence perspective, let's turn this round from a best practice point of view and say, look at your recruitment campaign and ensure that there is that fairness, consistency in place. You know, that you do ask candidates if there's any adjustments you should make. All candidates will feel that they were given an equal, fair opportunity to interview, you know, and the training that you give your managers, again, you know, a good interview panel will be open. They will be able to go through a fair interview for the candidates and explore questions, and you're less likely to then be challenged by candidates who feel they were unsuccessful on these grounds. We're covering obviously some other domain here in terms of recruitment, but you know, it's worth us saying, because we know that there are people out there that may challenge, feeling that they've been not treated fairly in this way, and because of SARS, you know, the subject to access request, you know, that's why it's so important that you have all of this data and how you hold information nailed down.
Absolutely. Now, one of the questions, and I think this is better suited for you to answer than me, Sally, is there a difference between just collecting CVs or application forms? Does it matter? Is one better than the other?
It's practical. It comes down to practical. Best practice, I always say, an application helps because you can capture more information. It streamlines what you're getting. It's consistent, so you know that you won't miss qualifications. You know that you'll ask certain things about any criminal convictions if that's what you need to do. So an application form is often better than a CV because of getting all the information you need. However, if you struggle to have that in place, CVs can be adequate as long as you do the follow-up, you know, and look at the information that's provided by candidates and does it satisfy what you need for the campaign. So application forms better for the reasons I've said. And also, you know, you do get people to tick a box in terms of consent as well, you know, when you go through that process. So there you go.
Awesome. Well, that was, thank you very much for all those questions. It just goes to show that even in a short amount of time, we can generate quite a lot of interest in what is a very complex subject. So my next question to all of you on the webinar, and for anyone afterwards, if you're interested in a follow-up, please email me or Sally. Our details will be on the next slide. But can I just ask, is there anybody that would want us to follow up with them after this? Now, if you can just say yes in the text box, what you'll get is an email from me on Monday with that follow-up. If you specifically want to have a follow-up with Sally, that's fantastic. Just say yes and put Sally, and I'll direct your contact details to Sally. There is absolutely no obligation at all to say yes. If you just wanted to come for the information, perfect. And then if it's okay with you, I will notify you of future webinars because they may be of interest to you. And again, you can opt out of notifications about future webinars. So thank you very much for everybody giving us 40 minutes of your time. I appreciate that your time is incredibly valuable. And Sally and I have enjoyed delivering the webinar. I hope that it's been incredibly useful. And please enjoy the rest of your day. If there's anything else that you need from us, please do contact us. And I'm just going to flick back to the slide that has my contact details and Sally's contact details. So thank you. Have an awesome day. And here's hoping that you are now able to run or are confident that you're running compliant recruitment campaigns under regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.